What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be doing an old espresso machine. Due to my love for coffee, I'm kind of surprised I haven't done more coffee related things on this channel, so while looking online for this week's model, I came across this old espresso machine, this La Pavoni from the 70s I believe, and just it had really cool style and I love the bright orange, so I thought it'd just be a lot of fun to make. So without further ado, let's just get started. Alright, so starting off with a cube, I'm going to start blocking out the main shapes. So I'm going to start off with all the larger objects and then slowly work my way to the smaller ones. But since I'm not working with any schematics or any measurements, I don't actually know the size of this espresso machine, so it's going to take a little bit of playing around with the shapes and sizes just to make it look a little bit proportionately accurate. So bear with me, we're just going to take our time and start blocking things out. for this bottom part, usually I would delete all the faces that you're not going to see in the final render, but in this situation, because we're planning to do some metal holes later on in the material, I need to add something underneath so you're not looking through to nothing. So I can just paint this black later on and not really worry about it. It can be very small on my UV map, but just making a note of it so you know that's the reason why I'm adding a plane here, just so later on when we do those holes, you can see something behind it. Alright, so this next plane is going to be those metal holes that I was talking about. Now, in a lot of my other videos, I tend to just make those holes directly into my geometry, just by creating a higher poly model. Now, in this video, I want to do things a little bit different and actually do those directly into my textures. I want to show how you can get away with a lot of things by just putting them directly in your textures rather than actually creating a high poly model. So, not creating holes right now, but we'll do it later in Substance. And then highlighting all these faces, I can Control E to extrude them, and I can give them a little bit of thickness, and then I can go delete those faces behind after. Same thing for this top piece, just like the other one, I'm going to create another plane and then do those holes directly in the Substance Painter. So while looking at my reference, it looked like this top metal piece was actually attached to that back plane. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and delete these faces, then I can combine these two objects together and then just do a simple bridge between those two edges. And then just add a nice little bevel just so it looks a little bit more smooth. So the shape is coming together, now I just need to play around with the proportions a little bit. So next up is creating a boolean in that top plane. So I'm going to go ahead and create a few edge loops, that way I can select that multi-cut tool and just connect some of those vertices after the boolean is created. So I'm going to create those edge loops, make it nice and tight to where I want that hole to go, and then I can create a low poly cylinder and then boolean out a hole. And then I'm going to add a few more edge loops as well, just to make my life a little bit easier when it comes to adding this hole texture. That way I can just select these certain faces and apply that material to it. And like I just mentioned, once the boolean is created, I can go ahead with the multi-cut and the target weld tool and start merging and connecting some of those vertices. Alright, so now that the boolean is created, I can go ahead and create another cylinder so I can start building out that knob that sits on top. I don't want to worry too much about getting the knob perfect right off the start. I just want to go ahead and select some of those faces so I can extrude them outwards and start getting the rough shape that I was looking for, and I can come back afterwards to finish it out. Alright, so now that the knob is roughly in the right place, I can move on to the other objects and then come back to finish it up afterwards. So I'm going to start off with the large lever that sits on top. So to start that off, I'm going to go ahead and select this edge and give it a bevel. Then I can delete that little plane just so I have a spot for this lever to fit into. And then I can start blocking out all those shapes. So next up was moving on to those handles. Now, I did mention earlier how I wanted to keep this model on the lower poly side, and I kind of went against that here and added a few more polys to this handle so I can extrude those edges. Now, you could just fake that directly into the texture, so I wanted to make a note of that because you don't have to follow this and actually extrude them. But the reason why I did it was just because this handle's sticking out towards the camera, and I thought it would look a little bit more realistic and a little bit better if it was actually in the geometry rather than faking it in the material. So what I do here is, just because the object's not high enough in polys so I can extrude all those edges, I double click all those edges and just bevel them. Now this makes my life a little bit more difficult because I have to go clean it up afterwards. So what I should have done is just created a higher poly cylinder off the start, and then I could just extrude that longer. And I would already have those edges correctly in place, so I can just go select those faces and extrude them. Now, because I just beveled them, it's going to create some weird artifacts in my faces on this handle, so I have to go in afterwards and clean it up. So to save yourself a little bit of time, and you don't have to actually follow along to exactly what I'm doing here, it would just make your life a little bit easier if you start off with a higher poly cylinder. So all I'm doing here to clean it up is just hitting that circularize tool on the top, and that way it's just evenly spacing out all those faces, so it's not going to give me any weird artifacts. And then once that's looking good, I can go ahead and select all those faces and extrude them outwards. Now for this next bottom part where the coffee actually comes out of, I didn't know exactly how this part worked, so I'm just going to play around with it a little bit until I got something that looks similar to my reference image. And just to save myself a little bit of time while figuring this thing out, I'm just going to work on half of it so I don't have to work on the whole object, and then I can cut it in half and then mirror it over to the other side. so now that's looking pretty good. I can go ahead and duplicate this object over, flip it around, and then merge these two pieces together. Alright, so next up was creating those dials. So this was a really strange shape and I didn't know exactly how to go about it. So what I decided to do was create a cube and then add a few edge loops so they're 8-sided, and that way I can select every second face and then extrude those outwards to start positioning those into the rough shape of that dial. Now, since it's such a weird looking shape, it's going to take a little bit of playing around with until it starts looking somewhat accurate, so bear with me as I start moving around these edges.
Check it.
Alright, so now that that's looking pretty good, I can select it and duplicate it over to create the second one.
Check it out. Check it.
And then starting off with another cylinder, I can start blocking out the gauge. Alright, so it's slowly coming together. Next up is creating that large label that sits on the front. So to do that, I'm going to start off with another cube, scale that into place, and then give it some small bevels. And now starting off with a cylinder, I can create those little legs that sit underneath it. So this machine has a large on and off switch that sits right on the front, so to do that I'm going to start off with a cube and then start blocking out those shapes. There's going to be two cubes, one for the outside border, then one for the switch that sits directly in the middle. So next up is moving on to what I believe is the frother. Now I could be completely wrong here. All it is just a skinny piece of metal that comes out from the top and kind of bends its way off to the side. So that's going to be pretty straightforward. All I'm going to do is create two cylinders and position them close together, one vertical, one horizontal. Then all I have to do is select them both and merge them into one object. Then delete those faces, double click those edges, and then bridge them together. Then all I have to do is change the curve type to blend and then add a few divisions, and then you'll get a nice flowing bridge that actually merges these two edges together. And then all I have to do is duplicate this object, flip it around, and then merge it back together again. And then just change the scaling and make it nice and small and skinny, and then scale it into position. Alright, so now that this one's done, there's one more on the left, but rather than bending, it just goes directly straight down. So to make my life a little bit easier, I'm just going to reuse this object I just created and just delete all those faces on the top and then slide that object over to the left side. Alright, so the modeling is almost done. We just have a few small shapes to finish up. So next up is moving on to this little tube that's on the left. Now I'm not exactly sure what this is. I think it might be the amount of water, so it has a max and a min height level. Now all this is just a bunch of pieces of metal and a little skinny tube that sits inside, so I'm going to start blocking out all these shapes. Now I'm going to quickly jump back to that on and off switch and add a few small bevels to it. Now you don't have to do this, you can keep your model on the lower poly side of things, and there's a lot of different techniques and blurring effects you can do directly in Substance Painter to help make these hard edges look a little more rounded without actually adding geometry to your model. But just because I'm not limited by any poly count or anything, I'm going to go add a few small bevels. Alright, so next up was moving on to those screws. Now, rather than creating those with geometry and adding a lot of polys, I'm actually going to fake that directly in Substance Painter. So all I'm going to do for those is just create a cylinder, give it a nice little bevel, and then just position those where I want those screws to be, and then I can create those indents directly in Substance Painter when it comes to the texturing. Alright, so now this isn't completely necessary and you don't have to do it, but I'm just going to go ahead and bevel out some of those edges on the side panel just to help it look a little more realistic when the light interacts with the object. Last but not least is creating this long metal rectangle that sits on the side of this panel. It has a little Eurobar badge on it, so to do that I'm just going to create a square and start blocking out that last shape. Alright, so that's basically everything for the modeling. I ended up fitting everything onto one texture map. I just copied over the right side and duplicated over to the left, so it's just basically fitting the exact same space on the UV map. And I just prioritized all the larger objects like the vents and the badges, and everything else I made smaller on the UV map. So it's pretty straightforward. And now it's time to jump into Substance Painter and start applying those textures. Alright, so now in Substance Painter I can load in my FBX for Maya. And once that's loaded in, take a quick look, things are looking good, so I can go over to the texture set settings and scroll down to the bake mesh maps. Then switch your output size to whatever size you'd like. I chose 4K, and then make sure to check that little box that says use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. Alright, so now you're ready to texture. So I'm going to start off with those metal area, the little metal graded area. Just I know it's going to be the most tedious amount of work, so I thought I would get it out of the way. So I'm going to go to the Materials tab and select this metal dots texture that's in Substance, and I can apply that to my object. Now all I have to do is right click, set it to a black mask, and then assign it to that front face. Now to get those holes to go see-through, I do have to change my shader. So top right corner, go to your shader settings and switch it to alpha blending. That way I can go down to my textures and add an opacity channel, and then those holes will actually appear see-through. So now it's just a matter of changing the scale and the offset to make it look accurate to the reference photo. So my photo was showing 8 holes deep and 16 holes across. So it's just a matter of spending a little bit of time changing the scale and the offset until I got those amount of holes. So I'm going to spend the next little bit just messing around with these numbers until I found something that I was happy with. Now that those holes are looking relatively accurate, I just have to go find a different metal material that I can apply over top of this. Now that the metal texture is applied, I can go back to those holes and just refine them to clean them up a little bit. So with the eraser tool, I can go erase all the other circles that are half appearing or partially appearing, and I can go with the brush tool and actually paste on any other holes that are missing. So there's 2 larger holes that actually sit in the middle of these smaller ones. So all I'm going to do is with the eraser tool, I'm going to go count the amount of holes so I know they're in the right spot, and then just erase a little area where I want these larger holes to appear. So since I'm having a hard time actually seeing these holes, I'm going to quickly apply darker metal material to those side panels, and since we added a plane underneath, it's really going to help show where those holes are. And then I can take that metal dots texture, duplicate it, and then scale it much larger to create those larger holes. So with the eraser brush, I can remove all the other circles around it, and then leave those 2 that are right in the center. And then it's just a matter of changing the offset and the scale just to make sure that they're centered. The holes were looking a little bit too big, so I'm just going to tweak these settings a little bit just to get something a little bit closer to what I had in mind. Alright, so now that that's looking good, I can go ahead and select some other metal textures to apply to my meshes. Alright, so now that that metal material is applied, I just wanted to add a little bit of a grunge effect to it. So I went over to the texture tab and started scrolling through those different grunge effects to find something I was happy with. So it's just a matter of clicking some, dragging it onto my roughness channel, and tweaking some of those settings and seeing how it looked. Now, I was being very indecisive here and it took me quite some time to actually find something I was happy with. So I'm just gonna fast forward a little bit until I finally found something I was happy with, and then I can start tweaking some of those settings. Alright, so here I am fast forwarded a tiny bit until I finally found a leaky grunge effect that I was happy with. Now, a lot of times you can get tunnel vision trying to get the perfect texture right off the bat, but a lot of the times I find once you get the surrounding materials actually applied to the other objects, it can help you actually dial in that texture that you were originally working on. So this is going to work for me temporarily. I can move on to applying the other materials and I can come back to it afterwards. Alright, so here I am jumping back to that first material I was working on. I just was trying to apply a few different grunge effects to see if I could find something I was more happy with. And I was definitely having a really hard time with this one, so I quickly just give up and move on to the other textures and the other materials, and I can come back to it afterwards. Alright, so here I am moving on to the side panels. Now I decided to go with a smart material as a base. I chose a steel painted scrap material that already comes with Substance. I just went in and started tweaking some of those settings. I removed a lot of the grunge and the dirt effects that come with it, and I just wanted to get a nice base that I could start working on. Alright, so now that those other large panels are textured, I can jump back to those first ones that I was struggling with and start tweaking some of those settings to get something I was happier with. So now that things are looking a little bit better, I can start moving on to those other meshes and applying those other materials. So now it was time to add that front logo. So all I did was jump on Google and I just Googled this brand's logo, found an image online, took that into Photoshop, and then I just basically inverted all the colors to make it black and white so I can create my own alpha. Then I exported that, drag it right into my Substance file, set that as an alpha, and then to my current session. Then all I did was just apply a plastic material. I can go change my alpha to this logo and I can paste that directly onto my mesh. So throughout this whole modeling process, you'll see me constantly jumping in and out of these grunge effects on different materials. I wasn't satisfied with the results I was getting, and I didn't want this object to look brand new since it's quite old, like 40 plus years. I thought it would look a little bit more realistic if it had a little bit of wear to it. So I'm going to constantly be tweaking these settings until I found something I was happy with. And to be honest, after actually the renders, I went back and tweaked a few things to re-render some of the images. So it just takes a lot of time tweaking some of these settings until you find something you're happy with, but you just gotta keep going until you get there. So next up was finishing up the other metal materials. So now that those metal materials are looking pretty good, I can quickly jump to those handles. So all I want to do is find a plastic bumpy material and I can apply to those meshes. Next up was moving on to those front handles. Now I wanted to keep it consistent and have the exact same shade of black as the handles are. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that same material over, but I'm just going to remove all that bump and grainy effect. Next up was the frother, so that was pretty straightforward. It was just a shiny aluminum, didn't look like there was much dirt on there. I actually quickly tried to apply a few grunge effects, but it just looked a little bit off, so I kept this one fairly clean and just went with this nice clean aluminum texture. And next up was those screws, so I just went ahead and found another smart material and then I could apply it to those meshes. Now while I was applying these screw textures, I noticed how that front panel, all of those grunge effects were actually running horizontally, not vertically. And that's just because of the position and the orientation that this was on my UV map. So all I had to do was just duplicate that same orange texture over and just reassign it only to that front panel, so then I could just rotate that texture and that grunge effect so it looked like it was actually going vertically. And while I'm already on this texture, I'm going to go ahead and start tweaking a few of those settings and adding a little bit more edge wear to it. Alright, so now just jumping back to those screws so I can finish those off. So just to create those indents into the screws themselves, all I had to do was select a plastic material and drag that into the folder that's actually assigned to those screws. All I have to do is make sure that that's below the base color, so when I actually assign a height channel to it, you're only seeing the height being affected and you're not seeing the color or anything like that. So it's just a matter of going through these alphas and finding something I was happy with, and then just pasting those directly onto those bolts. Now I made sure that every bolt, I just changed the angle a tad just to make it look a little more realistic, so every bolt is not aligned perfectly and they have the exact same rotation. Just those small details can go a long way and make your models look a little more realistic. Alright, so next up was the gauge. So I just wanted to go find a metal material that I could apply to the outer part of the gauge. So all I did for the gauge was jump on Google and find a pressure gauge that was similar or identical to the one that was on this Espresso machine. So all I did was save that as a PNG, and then I can just click and drag that right into my Substance file and set that as a texture into the current session. Now I did notice how there's a piece of glass over top, so if I went ahead and just pasted this on, I actually wouldn't be able to see it. So I had to quickly go back into my textures and go find a glass material that I could apply to this plane first. That way afterwards when I start pasting on this gauge, I can actually tell if the rotation and if it looks accurate. So now that that glass is applied, it's just a matter of going back to that gauge image and pasting that onto the mesh. So I just needed to make sure that it was correctly centered. The first time I pasted on, the rotation was a little bit off because of my UV map, so it's just a matter of finding the correct rotation to make sure it's centered. that the gauge is done, it's time to move on to applying the other materials. So for the side label, I tried to find a font in an alpha in Substance Painter that I was happy with, but it was just looking a little bit off. I probably could have gone with that first one that I chose, but my reference photo was just showing the fonts were a little bit different, and I just wanted to find something that was a little more accurate. So I quickly jumped into Photoshop, found a font that I was a little more happy with, and I exported that as an alpha. And just like the other ones, I applied a plastic material that I can go find the alpha I created, and I can paste on that logo right onto the side. And then same thing for this on switch. There is a power on symbol alpha in Substance Painter, but on this machine it's just a simple circle. So I decided just to go ahead with the brush and paint on a circle, and then with the eraser tool just erase the inner part. So I have that same on switch that's similar to the one that's on this Espresso machine. So next up was moving on to those objects that are on the left, the little water height level max and min, or whatever it is. I just decided to choose that same metal that's on that back panel so I can apply it to those pieces. Alright, so next up was moving on to the label itself. Now I decided to do this directly in Substance Painter rather than just doing it in Photoshop. I know I could have got those lines perfectly straight in Photoshop, but it's such a small part you're probably not going to be able to tell, and it just saved me a lot of time just doing it directly here. So all I did was choose a plastic material, give it an off-white color enough to assign it to that rectangle. Then I could choose a square alpha and go in and start painting on these color strips. Now the color was showing up a little bit bright, so all I did was just change the opacity on those colors, the green and the red, just to make it blend in a little bit more with the white and not make it stand out so much. And then I just went ahead and chose a different alpha for the fonts and just pasted on that min and max. And like I mentioned, I could have gone into Photoshop to get these lines perfect. I was struggling a little bit to get these lines to look as straight as I could, but it just saved me a little bit of time, and because it's far in the back, you probably won't be able to tell. Alright, so last but not least was creating those holes on the top mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and select those same materials that we used at the very beginning to create the other holes, and I can just copy those over to create these ones. So while I was modeling this out, I went ahead and added a few edge loops to make my life a little bit easier when it came to applying this texture. So all I have to do is switch over to the projection tool, switch it to faces, and I can select each face that I want these holes to appear on. And at this point, it's just like before, it's a matter of changing the scale and the offset just to get those correct number of circles and those holes that are actually on the top plane. So I'm going to speed up this next little bit, as that's all I'm doing is just using my reference photo to copy the exact same amount of holes so they appear in the right spots. Alright, so as you can see on the top here, all those lines aren't perfectly straight, so some of these circles are getting slightly cut off and some are slightly appearing. And that doesn't matter too much, it just matters about getting these roughly into the right positions, and then afterwards with the brush tool, I can go fix all those circles that are slightly getting cut off, or with the eraser tool, just erase all the ones that aren't needed. So don't stress too much about getting it too perfect, so you can always go afterwards and touch it up. And it was looking a little bit thin, so I decided to go paint on one more row of circles. Alright, so all those holes are done. I just missed one more texture, just the feet, so I'm going to go add a nice little rubber material to apply to those, and then we're all wrapped up. Now quickly jumping into the renderer, I can fix that floor height just to match up with the bottom of my model, and then take a quick look to see how things are looking. Now for some reason I thought it was looking a little bit plain. Most of these objects that I create have little cords coming out the back, and I thought that would be a nice little addition that I can add to the model. So I quickly jumped into Maya and just quickly threw together a little cord. So now jumping back into Substance Painter, I can go up to the Edit tab and go down to Project Configuration, and then I can go select my new FBX that I just exported from Maya, and I can load in that new updated model that I just created. All I have to do now is just rebake those textures since there's new geometry added to the scene. And once those textures are rebaked, I can quickly apply some materials to those meshes. Alright, so now quickly jumping back into the renderer, I can see how things are looking. And things are looking good, so it's just a matter of changing the environmental map to find some lighting that I was happy with. That just helps these textures pop, and then I can render out some images. Now usually I just do some renders quickly out of Substance Painter to save me some time, but I thought it'd be a good idea just to throw this in Substance Stager just to see what other type of renders and lighting I can come up with. Alright, so now quickly jumping into Stager, I'm going to scale up my model, and I'm not going to do too much here. I'm just going to throw in a 3-point light and start editing those key light, fill light, and backlight intensities and directions those lights are coming from. Now I want to make a note, I'm not using Stager to its full potential at all. I know you can definitely have more control over those final renders comparing to Substance Painter, but there are things from both that I do like, and I'm not sure which one I actually like more than the other. So I wanted to see what you guys thought. Let me know in the comments if you do prefer final renders out of Stager or if you prefer them straight out of Substance Painter. Like I said, I'm a fan of both, so that's why I thought I'd just ask in this video to see which ones you guys prefer. But that's basically everything for this week's video. I hope you guys liked it. It was definitely a lot of fun to make. And if you did like it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.